In the end, as Shizun, Shen Qingqiu had absolutely no duty to help his disciples simmer down, even if he'd started the fire in the first place. Shen Qingqiu shoved Luo Binghe off of him, slapped a palm against his chest, and sent a few waves of spiritual energy into him. Though it was pitifully meager, he had no more to give, and whatever he could summon was a sum total. As for everything else, just ignore it, just ignore it. After getting out of the coffin, he pulled and tugged, dragging Luo Binghe towards the, quote, far east end, unquote, as Menmo had instructed. As his journey stretched on, the walls of the corridor began to dampen, and the floor beneath them grew slippery, covered in green moss. It became harder and harder to find steady footing, and Shen Qingqiu slowed his pace so he wouldn't slip. As he continued, the moss gave way to more vegetation. Wild grasses and thickets of flowers began to emerge too. The corridor gradually widened, and the trees of varying heights rose from the ground. The floor was no longer only wet, but also snaked with the twisted roots of old trees, causing Shen Qingqiu to trip from time to time. Flying insects swooped past and bird calls echoed. The blue-black ceiling suddenly soared, and the white crystals embedded in it twinkled, looking like a veil of stars in the night sky. Though it gave the impression that they were in a forest, in truth, they hadn't left the holy mausoleum. They had just entered a special tomb within it. Every tomb in the holy mausoleum had been personally designed by some demon noble of a past generation while they were still alive. The result was that it was home to all sorts of wonders, numbering in the thousands. It was just like an apartment building. When folks moved in, everyone got the same base suite, and anything else was the product of the residents renovating and decorating in accordance with their preferences. The mechanically skilled preferred their tricks and divination devices. Those familiar with demonic beasts raised monstrous tomb guardians, and those gifted in herbology cultivated poisonous flowers and rare grasses. The owner of this tomb was clearly the last type. Though these plants appeared ordinary and common to the eye, Shen Qingqiu definitely didn't want to touch them. He removed his outer robe and draped it over both his head and Luo Binghe's, tightened his arm around Luo Binghe's waist, and carefully walked onward. The grass rustled. A frosty beam of white light shot at them through the air, along with the sharp sound of something breaking. Shen Qingqiu snapped the fingers of his left hand, and Shouya's sword shot from where it was sheathed at his waist, crossing blades to divert the sneak attack with a clang. But, in the end, this reduced neither opponent's momentum even a bit. Before Shen Qingqiu had finished dealing with this trouble, a second arc of white light arrived. This one went straight for Luo Binghe's throat. Shouya's sword had blocked the first sword, and Shen Qingqiu couldn't summon it back, nor could he throw Luo Binghe aside. If he touched those plants, it was all over. In a moment of desperation, Shen Qingqiu twisted slightly, raised his arms, and caught the sword point in his bare hand. The blade tore open his palm, but was caught solidly in his grasp and advanced not an inch further. His blood didn't drip down so much as it poured. Half of Shen Qingqiu's clothes and the jade-green grass on the ground were instantly coated with a layer of crimson. Now he finally knew exactly how much it must have hurt for Luo Binghe when he had grabbed Shen Qingqiu's blade with his bare hand in Jinglan City. Blood-colored light dyed Shen Qingqiu's eyes red. His head snapped up, and his pupils contracted. He never would have guessed that these two were the quote strays Tianlangjun had mentioned. A pair of figures walked out from behind a gnarled and sturdy old tree. Or to be more accurate, only one of them walked. The other was pushed on a tiny cart, something like a wheelchair. The standing individual was a beautiful woman, her waist slender and figure curvaceous. though the person being pushed sat on a wheelchair and their entire body below the neck was swaddled in a thick blanket. Shen Qingqiu was quite familiar with the face that was still exposed. That flying sword continued to push forward. Its force left Shen Qingqiu with no choice but to hold the blade tight, even as it was about to cut half of his hand right off. But the expression on his face remained unwavering. "Miss Chiu, old palace master," he said with a fake smile, "I hope you've been well." Chiu Haitang's gaze filled with rage. The old palace master's head jerked, and when he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Does Big Lord Shen think I look well?" Quote, "I hope you've been well," was just a common greeting. It usually didn't mean anything. Shen Qingqiu forced out a laugh. When he looked closer, he discovered that the word, quote, "well," really was a great mockery when deployed in this case. Before, the old palace master had been like unto an ascended immortal. At both their first meeting at the Immortal Alliance Conference and their unhappy parting in Jinglan City, his outer appearance and bearing had been pristine. But the current old palace master's typically immaculate snow-white beard was filthy and matted, and his visage looked as ancient as if he'd taken a trip through the underworld. The wrinkles on his face were packed even thicker than the gnarled bark of the ancient tree behind him. The old palace master's voice was grim. "You must be very curious as to how I ended up in this state." Shen Qingqiu thought to himself, "Can I just say I'm not curious? Then will you let me pass?" But when he spoke, he said, "This humble one heard that old palace master went away into travelling seclusion." The old palace master chuckled. "Travelling seclusion? And you really believed that? In all of Huan Hua Palace, in all the cultivation world, how many people actually believe that? If you want to know the true state of affairs, you have to ask your darling disciple." Though Shen Qingqiu didn't know exactly what had happened, it looked like the old palace master was here to get even with Luo Binghe. Keeping his expression steady, Shen Qingqiu tucked Luo Binghe behind himself, shielding him as much as possible. Qiu Hangtang spat out. "Shen Jiu, I said a long time ago I wouldn't mistake you even if you burned to ash. I knew your self-detonation in Huayu City must have been some sort of trick. Dying to atone for your crimes? Ha! As if you're that sort of person. I saw through you on first sight in that demon vixen's territory. So you didn't die after all." "You recognized only my physical body and not my soul. What use is that?" Shen Qingqiu had nothing to say. The day Shen Qingqiu was caught in Sha Hualing's Chuying cave, he had seen Qiu Haitang only briefly while saving the cultivators of various sects, and this had, it seemed, aroused her suspicions, enough for her to keep an eye out from then on. He feared that as long as he returned to Changqiu Mountain sect and was taken away by Luo Binghe, Qiu Haitang had crossed the borderlands and followed them all the way to the demon realm. When Luo Binghe was capturing a herd of black moon rhinoceros pythons to break through the holy Muslim's barrier, he must have been wearing himself to the point of exhaustion. His mind scattered, with no attention to spare for keeping up his guard, and he therefore hadn't noticed the people sneaking in after him. To summarize, you really couldn't underestimate a woman's grudge. But Shen Qingqiu had genuinely never anticipated this team-up, nor did he know when Qiu Haitang had come into contact with the old palace master. Although, when Shen Qingqiu thought to question the timing, he had a sudden epiphany. Did the old palace master play a part in Miss Chiu's surprise appearance in Jinglan City? He asked. Since Zhu Zilang had denied that her arrival was his doing, someone else must have been fanning the flames as well. How else could Qiu Haitang have had the chance to show her face on the front lines with her measly little sect? The old palace master let out a cold laugh, giving neither an answer nor a denial. A few tiny tufts of white fluff, like dandelion seeds, drifted past Shen Qingqiu's field of vision, swirling through the air, he said. This humble Shen does not believe he ever offended the old palace master. As events have progressed this far, there are no further secrets I must keep to myself, said the old palace master. His voice was faintly hoarse, as if a lump of phlegm blocked his throat. When Luo Binghe joined my Huan Hua Palace, I took care to mentor him and intended to endorse him, but he refused to take me as his master, nor would he marry my daughter. Instead, he just wouldn't let go of you. Of course, I had to thoroughly investigate Peak Lord Shen to see what sort of extraordinary person you were, but I never expected that instead I would unearth your numerous old affairs. I know your details and background in and out, who you took as your master, what you did under him, exactly how you became disciple of Changqiong Mountain. What a colourful tale! Even without the drama with the sower, you would surely have been sent to the water prison. But who could have expected that fate had other plans and I needn't have gone to the trouble? So, the Huan Hua Palace disciples' horrible attitude towards Shen Qingqiu in Jinlan City hadn't been because of Luo Binghe's manipulations, but the old palace master's intentional influence. Shen Qingqiu couldn't resist taking another look at Luo Binghe. If only this child had been more adaptable with his thinking and taken another master, so many problems could have been avoided. But Shen Qingqiu could never resent him for his bull-headed persistence. He could only sigh. The old palace master has looked upon my disciple highly, yet the palace master's 2 sword strikes were clearly directed at him. Your words and actions do not seem to align. Back then was back then. Now things are not as they were, said the old palace master. Peak Lord Shen, please step aside. I do not care what happens to you. I just want this boy to pay for what he's done. If I step aside, the palace master will kill only him and leave me be. Qiu Haitang let out a cold laugh. He'll leave you be, but I'm still here. Her fighting abilities were far inferior to his, and she should have been of no consequence. However, in these circumstances, she presented quite a bit of trouble. That brute turned his back on his benefactors and left me in this state, said the old palace master. I won't rest until I kill him myself. If he really turned his back on his benefactors, Shen Qingqiu said, he wouldn't have spared your life, or that of your daughter. Grass ought to be pulled up by the roots. He understands this better than even you or me. Shen Qingqiu had never in 1,000 years thought that one day he would argue on Luo Binghe's behalf. When he heard those words, the old palace master squawked a cackle. Qiu Haitang tore the blanket from his body. For a few seconds, Shen Qingqiu stopped breathing. Below the blanket, only a uniformly rectangular torso remained. All 4 limbs were gone. The old palace master had been carved into a human stick. The master of a sect was now nestled in a broken-down little cart, filthy and barely human, left with only a head that could turn on its neck. The downfall of the original Shen Qingqiu had been transferred to the old palace master. Now this was worth holding a grudge over. It wasn't something that could be solved with a few words of persuasion, some chicken soup for the soul, or an appeal to Buddhist compassion. The old palace master let out a cold laugh. It was all your darling disciple's doing, you see. I wish he had pulled up the grass by its roots. Shen Qingqiu fully agreed. Why hadn't he pulled up this grass by its roots? Of these 2 strays, one wanted to kill Luo Binghe and one wanted to kill Shen Qingqiu. Qiu Haitang's cultivation was insufficiently powerful, so she had needed someone's assistance. The old palace master was much stronger than her, but he was down on his luck. A starved camel was still larger than a horse, and the old man had once been the leader of a sect. Even though he had lost his limbs and was unable to move freely, his spiritual energy hadn't weakened. This was what they meant with the sayings, quote, men and women complete and complement each other, or, quote, the blind carrying the lame, unquote. Shen Qingqiu snapped the sword blade with his bare hands and tossed it into a nearby brush, his stare fixed on the two people poised to attack. In truth, he could make a bet. Even if Luo Binghe's OP abilities were useless against a character like Tianlangjun, whose data wasn't pulled from the original work, the old palace master was a character grounded within the bounds of the original story. The protagonist's plot armor probably had yet to lose its effect against him. Shen Qingqiu could likely just step back and leave Luo Binghe to his own devices, just like how he had screwed over Dier, the Skinner demon, in the Shuanhu city plotline. He could let the old palace master hack at Luo Binghe and see who, in the end, would finish off whom. The old palace master said leisurely, I'll ask again. Will you step aside or not? Shen Qingqiu lowered his arm. The blood that had slowed its steady flow from his palm began to drip once more. The old palace master said himself that he is my darling disciple, he said in an even tone as he lifted his head. Tell me, do you think I'd step aside? There was nothing for it. Now was not the same as then. No matter what, Shen Qingqiu couldn't convince himself to use the protagonist's plot armor, to coldly stand aside and let someone else hack at Luo Binghe, to bet on whether he would live or die. If at this point he could still use Luo Binghe and put him in danger like that with a clear conscience, he really would be like the Scum villain of the original novel. The old palace master's eye suddenly bulged, and several shouts exploded from his mouth. He had lost his limbs, so he poured his spiritual energy into his voice, using this to attack. With every shout, a powerful spiritual flow swept over Shen Qingqiu like an onslaught of blades, the power of the voice no less than that of a spiritual blast. Grass and foliage thrushed back and forth, leaves flying from trees. Shen Qingqiu used his still bleeding right hand to block a few waves with the sheath of his sword. The tremors caused the wound to explode with agony, but he couldn't switch hands. If he didn't keep holding Luo Binghe in his left arm, he was afraid he'd drop him. Even though the old palace master had been carved into a human stick, his spiritual energy hadn't weakened in the slightest. No wonder Qiu Haitang had chosen to rely on him. As Shen Qingqiu thought this, the old palace master suddenly let out a howl. A light cracking sound came from Shouya's sheath, and Shen Qingqiu failed to block the assault. Overcome, Shen Qingqiu toppled backward. As he fell, he turned and used his own body to cushion the fall, not letting Luo Binghe land on the ground, and for his efforts was yet again crushed to the point he saw stars. The old palace master finally stopped howling, and Qiu Haitang slowly pushed him closer. He caught his breath for a while, then looked down at Shen Qingqiu, who still held Luo Binghe. You really do protect him a great deal. Qiu Haitang clenched her teeth. Fake! It's all fake! This bastard! Who's he putting on a show for? Why not fight back with your spiritual energy? The old palace master asked. Because I've already run dry, of course, Shen Qingqiu replied. Tuft after tuft of white fluff flew past, nearly alighting upon Luo Binghe's deathly pale cheek. Shen Qingqiu blew lightly, and they veered off and away. The old palace master thought Shen Qingqiu had accepted his fate, and so turned his attention away, his gaze instead landing on Luo Binghe's quietly sleeping face. The hollowing fury suddenly dropped clean away from the old palace master's expression, replaced with a kind of enraptured look. Shen Qingqiu held his tongue. Something was very off about that gaze. The old palace master looked on for a while, bewitched, then sighed. They look most alike when his eyes are closed, or when his expression is cold. The old palace master's stare was palpable as it crawled up and down Luo Binghe's face. If he still had hands, they definitely would have reached out to touch him by now. Shen Qingqiu's stomach turned, and his arms moved unconsciously to pull Luo Binghe's head further into his embrace. Now Luo Binghe was resting intimately against his body, and even his head leaned upon Shen Qingqiu's chest. Shen Qingqiu said severely, "Take a good look. This is not Su Xiyan." This name woke the old palace master from his daze. "Why wouldn't you listen to my orders?" he spat. "Why wouldn't you just listen to me? Was I not good to you? Didn't you want Huan Hua Palace? Didn't you want my seat? I knew you wanted it ever since you were young. If you just listened to me, who wouldn't have passed down to you? But one after the next, both of you ingrates spat on everything I gave you. Spat on everything I gave you." He snarled curses and raged, pouring every poisonous word in his vocabulary onto Tianlangjun and Shen Qingqiu, then roared about ingrates several dozen times in a row before his expression made an abrupt 180, becoming gentle. He said in a parental tone, "Xiyan, come here. Shizun has something for you. Drink up." The old palace master had sunk in a trance, and saliva dripped from the corner of his lip as Qiu Haitong stepped back slightly, disgust evident on her face. Epiphany sparked through Shen Qingqiu, and his stomach turned even more intensely. No wonder the old palace master had always been so good to Luo Binghe, to an almost unsettling extent. No wonder that Su Xiyan, despite being his most beloved disciple, had held absolutely no attachment to Huan Hua Palace and had readily betrayed her sect to run off with a demon youth without even looking back. This, quote, love must not have been much different from molestation, and the old palace master's favorable interest in Luo Binghe was definitely founded in the shade of a former beloved disciple that the sect leader had seen in him. He had extended his perverse possessiveness of Su Xiyan to Luo Binghe, deluding himself into thinking he could groom Luo Binghe into an obedient, darling child. But looking at him in this crazed state, Shen Qingqiu feared it wouldn't be anything so simple as making Luo Binghe his successor. Nor would, quote, obedient, unquote, be relegated to the literal meaning of the word. No wonder Luo Binghe had carved him into human swine. Shen Qingqiu covered the back of Luo Binghe's head with one hand and pressed Luo Binghe's face into his own chest so the old palace master couldn't keep fantasizing at him. This really was more than he could bear. "Have you had enough?" As soon as that visage was hidden from his sight, the old palace master's face immediately collapsed, twitching as if his muscles were seizing, his gaze overflowing with hatred and resentment. He snapped open his mouth, but no sound came from his throat. His eyes bulged, and his entire body seemed to have frozen into a statue carved from stone. Shen Qingqiu held his breath for a short moment. Gurgles came from the old palace master's throat, and bloodshot veins crawled up the whites of his eyes.